Who was the last caveman of his kind, and how did he live, die, or simply vanish into history? The truth is more shocking than you'd expect. For centuries, we've looked back at our prehistoric ancestors with curiosity. We imagine them surviving in harsh environments, inventing tools, painting animals on cave walls, and sitting quietly under the stars beside a glowing fire. But one question still remains. What happened to the very last caveman? Who was the final Neanderthal? Was it a man or a woman? Did they realize they were the last of their kind? And if they did, how did they spend their final years while the world around them kept changing? This story goes beyond one person. It's about the closing chapter of an entire human species, the Neanderthals, and what their end reveals about survival, extinction, and the connection we still share with them. And there's also a surprising twist. A man named Aliah is believed to have lived in a way that closely resembled the caveman lifestyle, even in the modern world. So let's explore the lives they led, the challenges they faced, and the final footsteps of humanity's earliest relatives. The rise and fall of the Neanderthals. Neanderthals weren't some rough, half-evolved version of us. They were smart, capable, and incredibly strong. For a long time, they thrived across Europe and parts of Asia, far longer than modern humans have been around. They hunted mammoths, made sharp tools from flint, wore animal hides, and even buried their dead. Some researchers believe they played music using flutes made from bird bones. These weren't mindless cave dwellers. They were Homo neanderthalensis, close relatives with whom we shared a common ancestor hundreds of thousands of years ago. But something shifted about 40 years ago. Slowly, they started to disappear. Within just a few thousand years, they were gone. What caused that to happen? No one knows for sure, but there are a few strong possibilities. Some believe the climate turned against them. The Ice Age brought harsh changes that made food hard to find. Others point to the arrival of modern humans, Homo sapiens, who may have brought new challenges. We had more advanced tools, more connections with other groups, and possibly larger communities that made survival easier. But the story isn't all about conflict. There's evidence that Neanderthals and modern humans lived side by side. In some places, they even formed families together. Many of us today carry traces of Neanderthal DNA. Even so, Neanderthals eventually disappeared. What's often missed is how long that took. It wasn't a sudden collapse. In a few remote places, small groups held on for thousands of years after most others were gone. Which brings us to a haunting question. Who was the very last Neanderthal? The last of the Neanderthals. We may never know their name, where they were born, or whether they were a man or a woman, but scientists have narrowed it down to a few places. One of the strongest clues points to the Rock of Gibraltar, a steep cliff at the edge of southern Spain. Inside Gorham's Cave, tucked into that rocky coastline, researchers found what might be the last known remains of a Neanderthal. They date back to about 40 years ago. It looks like a small group managed to survive there, long after Neanderthals had vanished from the rest of Europe. Could one of them have lived long enough to see unfamiliar faces, modern humans, starting to appear nearby? Picture that for a moment. You're the last of your kind. Everyone you knew is gone. The voices you once heard around the fire have faded. The trails you followed are overgrown. Maybe you catch glimpses of others in the distance, but they don't look like you. They don't speak like you. They don't come close. You keep going, unaware that your story is the final chapter of a long, ancient line. This kind of ending may have happened in more than one place. Scattered groups of Neanderthals, holding on as long as they could, while modern humans kept spreading and changing the world around them. We don't know exactly how those last few lives ended. Was it violence? Starvation? Illness? Or maybe they joined human groups and blended in, their identity slowly lost over generations. What we do know is that their end wasn't loud. There was no final battle or dramatic moment. The last Neanderthals faded quietly. But even in their silence, the story didn't really end. Aliah, the modern caveman. Now jump ahead, not to another ancient age, but to our own time. In 2004, something unexpected happened. Anthropologists and journalists were shocked to find a man living deep in the Zagros mountains of Iran, completely cut off from the modern world. His name was Aliah. He had been living alone in a cave for decades. When people first met him, they guessed he was about 60 years old, though no one knew for sure. What caught everyone's attention wasn't just the cave he lived in, but the way he had survived all those years. After losing his family to a disease outbreak, Aliah walked away from society and never came back. He found refuge in the mountains, where there was no electricity, no running water, no radio, and no human contact. He lived entirely off the land. He hunted small animals, gathered wild plants, drank from natural springs, and made do with what he could find. His clothes were stitched from animal hides. He used simple tools made from stone or whatever materials he could scavenge. The cave he lived in was dark and quiet, but for him, it was home. It wasn't all that different from how our early ancestors once lived. For more than 30 years, Aliah stayed away from people. The nearby villagers knew he existed and would sometimes leave food at the edge of the forest, but he never came out to meet them. Over time, he became known as the last caveman of Iran. In 2022, he was persuaded to leave the cave and move into a village for medical treatment. A few months later, he passed away. He was believed to be around 62. His story left many people wondering, was he really the last caveman? Was he holding on to an ancient way of life? Or was he simply a man trying to find peace far from the world? Aliah's life may have been quiet, but it reflected the same instincts that carried humans through thousands of years. He adjusted to the world around him, he found ways to survive, and he never gave up. Today, scientists understand that Neanderthals had a lot more in common with us than people used to think. They weren't just wild figures hiding in caves. They were smart, emotional, and deeply connected to each other. They felt love, grief, creativity, and care. They played music, looked after the sick, and honored the dead. Even after they disappeared, they didn't leave us with nothing. Their story continues in us. Every time we strike a match, shape something with our hands, or look up at the stars and wonder about our place in the world, we're part of something that began long before written history. And the last ones who held onto that way of life, whether they were Neanderthals in Gibraltar or men like Aliah living alone in the mountains, deserve to be remembered. They were the final link in a long chain, and their story still lives on. If this gave you a new way of thinking about what it means to be human, or made you curious about the past in a different way, go ahead and subscribe to the channel. Tap the bell so you don't miss the next story. We've got more coming your way. The question of how transgender people were treated in prehistoric societies leads us into a world without writing, nations, or formal laws. A time when understanding human identity depended on daily survival, spirituality, and community roles. Though the term transgender is relatively modern, human gender diversity is not. Studying the lives of transgender or gender non-conforming individuals from prehistoric times is difficult. There are no written records from the Paleolithic, Neolithic, or even early Bronze Age to tell us what people thought or felt. Instead, researchers rely on archaeological discoveries, burial customs, anthropological comparisons, and DNA analysis to uncover clues about how early humans might have understood gender roles and identities beyond the male-female binary. In modern terms, sex refers to a person's biological attributes, while gender refers to roles, behaviors, and identities that a society assigns. These categories are fluid and can vary across cultures and time. Applying today's definitions to prehistoric people must be done with care, but findings do suggest that gender diversity has long been part of the human experience. One of the earliest archaeological hints of gender variance comes from a burial in the Czech Republic dating to approximately 5000 BCE, belonging to the corded ware culture. This grave contained the skeleton of a biologically male individual, but the burial followed feminine customs. The body was placed on its left side, with the head facing west, a style traditionally reserved for women in that culture. Items placed in the grave were also considered feminine, such as domestic jugs rather than weapons or tools. Czech archaeologist Kamila Remishova-Věšínová, who led the excavation, stated, "From history and ethnology, we know that burials reflect not only biological sex but also gender identity." This discovery led some researchers to suggest that this person may have been gender non-conforming or transgender in their community. However, scientists caution against firm conclusions, as interpretations are limited by the small sample size and lack of written context. Another important case is the Suantaka grave in Hattila, Finland, dated to around 1050 CE. Originally thought to be the grave of a high-status woman due to the presence of two swords, including one with a bronze hilt and feminine clothing, further analysis added complexity. In 2021, researchers from the University of Helsinki conducted ancient DNA testing and found the individual had XXY chromosomes, a condition known as Klinefelter syndrome. This genetic variation can result in physical traits that blend male and female characteristics. The grave contained both masculine and feminine objects, suggesting that this person may have held a non-binary or transgender identity within their society, or at least one that was socially accepted and honored. Such findings indicate that prehistoric and early societies might have recognized more than two genders, or at least accommodated individuals who lived outside the binary. But without direct testimonies, researchers remain cautious about over-interpreting these rare cases. While prehistoric evidence is limited, Anthropologists studying indigenous and tribal societies that survived into modern times provide insight into long-standing patterns of gender diversity. Among many Native American tribes, individuals known as two-spirit people have long been recognized. This term refers to people who embody both masculine and feminine traits, and they often served as healers, teachers, artists, or spiritual leaders. The Zuni tribe, for example, honors Lamana, a male-bodied person who adopted a feminine role and was highly respected within the community. In South Asia, the Hijra community has existed for centuries, with documentation going back to the Mughal Empire. Though often marginalized in modern times, Hijras historically held important roles in rituals, blessings, and court ceremonies. Similarly, the Fa'afafin of Samoa and the Sworn Virgins of the Balkans demonstrate cultural traditions that accept or institutionalize third-gender roles. These are not prehistoric examples, but they suggest that recognition of gender variance is not new or Western, but rather a global human phenomenon with deep roots. When archaeologists examine cave paintings, carvings, and figurines from prehistoric times, some researchers propose that gender-fluid or androgynous imagery may have existed. For instance, in some prehistoric Venus figurines, the exaggerated features make it hard to determine specific gender markers. These figurines, dating back to around 30 BCE, are often interpreted as fertility symbols, but some may also reflect complex gender ideas. Another important area of research focuses on prehistoric shamanism. Shamans were believed to mediate between the human and spiritual world, and in some indigenous cultures, gender-variant individuals were often chosen for these roles. Some anthropologists suggest that shamans in Upper Paleolithic societies might have included gender-diverse individuals as their dual nature was considered powerful or mystical. A 1997 paper by Walter L. Williams, an anthropologist who studied gender-variant shamans in Eurasian traditions, argues that gender nonconformity was often linked with ritual status rather than exclusion. Looking at the daily life of prehistoric people, especially during the hunter-gatherer period, it is clear that gender roles were likely more flexible. Tasks such as hunting, gathering, tool-making, or caring for children were not always rigidly divided by sex. Archaeologist Lorna Tilley, who has studied caregiving in prehistoric societies, points out that survival often required cooperation and adaptability, meaning that skills mattered more than gender expectations. For example, evidence from early Mesolithic camps in Europe and Africa suggests that both men and women participated in hunting and foraging, depending on the needs of the group. This flexible system may have made space for individuals who didn't conform to binary gender roles. It wasn't until the agricultural revolution, roughly around 10 years ago, that societies began forming patriarchal structures, where property, inheritance, and labor became tied to biological sex roles. As humans moved into agriculture-based civilizations, gender roles became more rigid. With land ownership, heredity, and social hierarchies, societies increasingly placed men in dominant roles and restricted women and gender-variant individuals. This shift may have led to the marginalization of transgender and non-binary people in many regions. The rise of organized religion and legal systems also contributed to enforcing binary gender norms, often penalizing or excluding those who deviated from them. However, in earlier times, especially in small, mobile communities, cooperation and survival outweighed strict social codes. This might explain why evidence suggests a greater level of tolerance or social integration for gender non-conforming people in prehistoric settings compared to some later historical periods. Despite these findings, researchers emphasize the limitations of interpreting ancient gender identities. The absence of direct written records means that all interpretations must rely on context, burial customs, material culture, and in some cases, DNA testing. Archaeologists and anthropologists have to avoid projecting modern identities or politics onto ancient people. What appears to be evidence of transgender identity may have had different cultural meanings at the time. As noted by Dr. Ulla Moilanen, one of the researchers involved in the Suantaka study, the Suantaka grave forces us to consider that past people might have had ways of understanding gender that we do not yet comprehend. In recent years, advances in ancient DNA analysis have made it possible to revisit old graves with new tools. This can help clarify chromosomal makeup, genetic diseases, or population origins, contributing to more accurate reconstructions of individual identities in prehistoric societies. Ultimately, while there is no definitive evidence of a transgender identity in prehistoric times as defined today, the archaeological, anthropological, and genetic data suggest that gender diversity existed and was likely integrated into early human societies in various ways. The burial styles, artifacts, and social roles associated with certain individuals point to a broader understanding of gender than rigid binaries. These findings indicate that gender variance may have always been part of human existence, shaped by the environment, spiritual beliefs, and survival strategies. Prehistoric people may have approached gender with flexibility, assigning roles not based strictly on biological sex but on skills, responsibilities, and spiritual functions. By studying these early patterns, researchers continue to uncover how gender roles evolved and how modern societies might learn from the complex and diverse past of human identity. Ever wonder what cavemen actually did all day? Turns out, their lives were anything but lazy. Here's how they stayed busy from dawn to dusk. When we think about cavemen, the usual image pops up: messy hair, rough clothes, maybe holding a wooden club and sitting around a fire. But what were they really doing all day? Were they just passing the time, or was there more going on? Turns out, life back then was a lot more active and thoughtful than we give it credit for. Cavemen weren't just surviving. They were figuring things out, creating tools, working together, and laying down the basics of the life we live now. Finding food. If there was one thing that took up most of their time, it was finding food. Survival completely depended on it. And unlike us, they didn't have the luxury of walking into a store. They had to go out and get their meals themselves every single day. Hunting wasn't easy. Chasing animals through forests and rocky landscapes took serious effort. They used stone-tipped spears, and later on, tools like spear throwers and bows. And they didn't just hunt alone. They worked in groups, planning how to corner or trap their prey. It wasn't just about catching food, it was also about learning how to work as a team. But hunting didn't always go as planned. When the animals were hard to find or things didn't go well, they switched to gathering. Berries, nuts, roots, and leaves became their backup. This came with its own challenges. They had to know what was safe to eat, because one mistake could be deadly. That kind of knowledge wasn't random. It was passed down, taught carefully, and remembered like a mental guidebook to the wild. So gathering food wasn't just about picking whatever they saw. It was a mix of survival skills, sharp instincts, and years of experience shared across generations. Tools. And to gather or hunt properly, they had to have the right tools. They didn't have machines or metal, so they worked with whatever was around, like stone, wood, bone, even antlers. These simple materials were shaped into things like knives, scrapers, spears, and fishing hooks. It wasn't about randomly smashing rocks together. Making tools took real skill. Flint knapping, for example, meant carefully shaping stone into sharp edges. One wrong move and you could ruin something you'd spent hours working on, but if you got it right, that tool could be the reason your group ate that night. They also made things with more than one purpose. Bone needles were used to stitch animal hides into clothes. They set up traps to catch smaller animals or fish. Over time, their collection of tools kept improving. It showed how their thinking was growing too. Every new tool wasn't just useful. It was a small step forward in how humans learned to solve problems. Building shelter. Of course, even the best hunters and toolmakers needed somewhere safe to rest. Caves were great when they could find them, but that wasn't always the case. A lot of the time, they had to build their own shelters using whatever materials they had: branches, leaves, stones, and animal skins. They had to hold up against wind, rain, and cold nights, and they needed to be secure enough to keep wild animals away. Some were simple and temporary, built for groups that moved around. Others were more solid and meant to last longer for families that stayed in one place. These homes weren't only about protection, they brought people together. This is where they shared meals, took care of each other, and sat around the fire telling stories. These shelters became more than just a place to sleep. They were the beginning of something familiar: home. Tribes and togetherness. Cavemen didn't go it alone. They lived in small bands or tribes, and this social structure was essential to their survival. In these communities, roles were shared. Some hunted, others gathered, while elders passed down knowledge and children learned by watching and playing. This early sense of cooperation allowed the group to function like a single organism. If someone were injured or sick, others would care for them. Food was shared, and decisions were made collectively. And what's even more surprising, they found ways to communicate. They didn't have a spoken language like we do now, but they used gestures, sounds, and expressions to get their point across. It helped them plan hunts, stay safe, and teach each other. Over time, that kind of communication probably turned into the first steps toward real language. creativity, and expression. Even with all the effort it took just to survive, they still found room for creativity. They weren't only focused on food and shelter, they also had the urge to express what they felt. Cave paintings are one of the clearest signs of that. These weren't random drawings. Many showed animals, hunting scenes, or symbols, and they may have been used to tell stories, pass down knowledge, or take part in rituals. They made beads from shells, carved little figures, and even decorated their bodies. It shows they had emotions, beliefs, and a sense of beauty, things that went far beyond survival, play, learning, and growth. And while the adults were busy with survival, the kids were learning in their own way. Play wasn't just for fun. Running, hiding, chasing, and throwing were games. But they also helped kids build the skills they'd need later. Through play, they learned how to stay sharp, work with others, and move like a hunter. And they learned not in classrooms, but by watching, copying, and trying things out. Whether they were gathering food or helping around the camp, kids picked things up by being involved. Every moment was a chance to learn something that could one day save their life. Fire. And then came fire. One of the most important discoveries in human history. Fire changed everything. It provided warmth on cold nights, light after sunset, and protection from predators. But most importantly, it allowed cavemen to cook food, making it easier to chew and digest, and killing harmful bacteria. But fire wasn't easy to manage. Starting and maintaining a flame was a daily chore, requiring skill and constant attention. Knowing how to spark fire using friction or striking stones was a life-saving skill every tribe needed. Fire was their technology, a tool that gave them control over their environment in ways nothing else could. On the move. Cavemen were also nomads, often moving from place to place. Sometimes it was seasonal, animals migrated, or the weather shifted. Other times it was due to danger, scarcity of food, or simple curiosity. But every move meant learning a new landscape, new plants to study, animals to track, and dangers to avoid. This constant movement honed their adaptability and allowed early humans to spread far beyond their original homelands, a life far from lazy. So what did cavemen actually do all day? They hunted wild game with clever strategies, gathered edible plants with inherited knowledge, and crafted tools with precision. They built shelters, created art, shared wisdom, raised children, and kept the fire burning. They communicated, played, learned, explored, and cooperated. They worked together to solve problems, stay alive, and even make space for creativity and culture. Far from being lazy or dull, cavemen were innovators, survivors, artists, and community builders. Every hour of their day was filled with purpose, effort, and growth. Their lifestyle was tough, but incredibly rich, the blueprint of human development. And through it all, both men and women contributed equally, each playing vital roles to ensure their group's survival. Their story reminds us that human greatness didn't start with smartphones or skyscrapers. It began in the firelit shelters of those who came before us,